It began with a ring, not a sound, not a signal. A physical ring. 2,000 warships arranged in a perfect sphere around the entire solar system, 300 million kilometers from the sun, positioned with such geometric precision that the distance between each vessel was identical to within 3 meters. A ring of fire and metal and absolute authority, stretching from inside Mercury's orbit to beyond the Kuiper belt. A cage built around an entire civilization. The Galactic Compact called it a containment measure. Everyone else called it what it was: a blockade. It had never been done before, not at this scale. Smaller blockades had been used against individual colony worlds, single stations, wayward freighters. But enclosing an entire home system, an entire species, inside a military cordon that spanned hundreds of millions of kilometers, that was new. That was deliberate. That was the Galactic Compact sending a message not just to humanity, but to every species watching from the safe distance of their own star systems. This is what we can do, remember that. The stated reason was the Santiago incident, a human deep exploration vessel that had, 7 months earlier, crossed into a region of space the Compact had designated a protected observation zone without authorization. The crew had not known. The designation had been made 14 days before their crossing, communicated through diplomatic channels that humanity's Compact liaison had not yet processed. A clerical failure. A genuine, documented, provable clerical failure, for which the human government had formally apologized 4 times. The Compact had accepted the apology, and then blockaded the solar system anyway, because the Santiago incident was not the reason. The reason, the real reason, understood by every diplomat and military analyst and back-channel negotiator in the galaxy, was the Battle of the Kepler Zone, 8 months earlier. The battle that had never been supposed to happen, in which humanity had dismantled a Velthari pacification fleet with a precision and ferocity that had rewritten every galactic assessment of human military capability, and more dangerously, given other species ideas. The blockade was not punishment for a navigation error. The blockade was a message. We cannot erase what happened, but we can remind you, and everyone watching, who holds the walls. Rear Admiral Cassiel Morrow learned about the blockade the way most people learned about it, not through official channels, but through the sudden, complete absence of outgoing ships. She was commanding the supply convoy Meridian Run, 14 freighters carrying medical equipment, seed stock, and construction materials bound for the outer colonies, when every fold drive in the convoy simultaneously received an override lockout code she had never seen before. Emergency stop all drives. Authorization Galactic Compact Enforcement Division. She stood on the bridge of the convoy escort CSS Arrowhead and stared at the code for a long moment. Then she pulled up the long-range sensor array and looked outward, past Neptune, past the Kuiper belt, into the deep dark where the numbers said 2,000 ships were sitting. She was a small woman, Cassiel Morrow, compact in build with a face that looked younger than her 47 years and eyes that looked considerably older. She had been born on a station in the asteroid belt. She had never in her life lived on a planet. She had a sister on Ganymede, a brother on the colony world of Proxima Station, and a convoy that was now sitting dead in space because someone had decided that 14 freighters carrying medical equipment were a threat to galactic order. She turned to her communications officer. "Get me UEDC command." "The blockade is—" He stopped, started again. "Admiral, the blockade is jamming long-range communications. We're receiving compact frequencies only." "Then get me the nearest relay buoy." "Jammed." "Short-range ship-to-ship?" "Still operational, within the system only." She absorbed this. "So we can talk to each other. We just can't talk to anyone outside." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the sensor display. 2,000 ships. A perfect sphere. Beyond it, the outer colonies, 14 of them, that had been receiving supply convoys on a 17-day rotation cycle. Medical equipment, food supplements, atmospheric processors for the new settlements. Things that people needed, things that had a clock on them. She pulled up the supply inventory for each colony. She ran the numbers. She did it twice because the first time she thought she had made an error. She hadn't. At current consumption rates, with no resupply, Proxima Station, Her brother's station had 91 days of food reserves. The three youngest colonies, still in early terraforming phases and heavily dependent on supply lines, had less. 40 days. Maybe 50 if they rationed hard. The compact's containment measure had no stated end date. Morrow closed the inventory screen and was quiet for a very long time. Then she opened a new file and started writing. Not a report, not a formal complaint, not a diplomatic request, a plan. 3 days into the blockade, the compact's senior enforcement commander transmitted a message to UEDC headquarters. Admiral Throne Vath, a Kilvari, a species whose physical form resembled something between an architectural column and a weather system, spoke in measured, almost courteous tones. He expressed confidence that the containment period would be brief. He outlined the conditions for its lifting, a comprehensive review of human navigation protocols, submission of all exploration vessel flight plans for prior compact approval, and, buried in paragraph 11 of a 17-paragraph document, a formal acknowledgement that the Battle of the Kepler Zone had constituted an unauthorized military action, for which humanity accepted full compact jurisdiction. That last condition was the actual point. If humanity signed it, they were not just acknowledging a navigation error. They were retroactively criminalizing their own self-defense. They were telling every species in the galaxy that the compact had the right to dictate when a civilization was and was not allowed to protect itself. Secretary General Diallo read the document 3 times. Then she called her senior legal counsel, her military advisors, and Admiral Park, who was 3 systems away, and whose voice on the secure channel carried the particular flatness of someone measuring their words very carefully. "They're not going to lift it," Park said. "Not in 40 days, maybe not in 400. The third condition is designed to be unacceptable. They want us to either sign it, which breaks us politically, or refuse it, which lets them keep the blockade running indefinitely while claiming we're the obstacle to resolution." "And the colonies?" Diallo asked. A pause. 40 days. Another pause. "Cassiel Morrow filed a report," Park said. "You should read it." Diallo pulled it up while he was still on the line. She read it once fast, then again slowly. Then she was quiet for a moment. "This is insane," she said. It was not a criticism, it was an assessment. "Yes," Park said. "It might also be the only thing that works." No blockade in galactic history had ever been broken. This was not merely a statistic. It was a foundational assumption of compact military doctrine, the reason that blockades had become the preferred tool of coercion against species that were too visible to simply attack and too inconvenient to ignore. The logic was geometric and total. Enough ships positioned correctly covered every possible exit vector. Fold drives required a minimum charge time of 11 minutes, during which the vessel's location was precisely detectable. Any ship attempting a fold jump from inside a blockade sphere was simply a target that helpfully announced its own coordinates 11 minutes in advance. The doctrine had held for 2 centuries. No one had broken it because no one had found a way around the 11-minute problem. Morrow's plan was based on the premise that the 11-minute problem was not, in fact, the actual problem. She had written 47 pages. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Priya Danesh, had read all 47 pages in one sitting and then spent 20 minutes completely silent before saying, "You know this is either the most brilliant thing I've ever read or it's going to get us all killed." "Probably both," Morrow had said. The plan had 3 fundamental insights, each one building on the last. The first insight was about what a blockade actually guarded against. Compact blockade doctrine was designed to prevent organized military breakouts, large ships, military-grade fold drives, coordinated jumps. The 2,000 vessels were positioned and armed to intercept exactly that. Anything big, anything fast, anything that looked like a threat. What the doctrine was not specifically designed for, because no one had ever needed to specifically design against it, was the complete opposite. Slow, small, invisible. Not invisible in the stealth technology sense. Invisible in the sense of not registering as a meaningful threat. Invisible in the way that background noise is invisible to a sensor calibrated to detect signals. The second insight was about the construction capacity that humanity had been quietly developing in the asteroid belt for 30 years. Not military construction, industrial. The kind of unglamorous, massive-scale infrastructure building that no compact intelligence assessment had bothered to deeply analyze because it wasn't weapons, it wasn't ships, it wasn't interesting. Morrow had a complete inventory. She had requested it the night she wrote the plan, citing supply logistics as justification, which was technically true. What the inventory showed was something that made her sit very still for a while. Humanity had, in the asteroid belt, the capacity to build a lot of things very quickly. The third insight was the strangest one, and the one that had kept Dinesh silent for 20 minutes. It was about how blockade enforcement worked at the operational level, specifically about what 2,000 ships crewing 600 people each were actually doing moment to moment during a containment operation that was intended to last months. They were watching, monitoring, running sensor sweeps, processing an enormous quantity of data about a solar system that contained, nominally, the entire human civilian and military apparatus. They were looking at a lot, which meant they were filtering a lot, which meant there was a threshold, a noise floor, below which a signal was processed as irrelevant and dismissed. Morrow had done some calculations about what that noise floor was. She had then done some calculations about what humanity could do that stayed below it. When she briefed Admiral Park, she used a phrase that he later said he had been thinking about for weeks, without quite being able to articulate. "The blockade is a wall," she said. "We're not going to go through it, we're not going to go over it, we're going to go under it, and we're going to do it in a way that they won't realize is happening until it's already done." Park had been quiet for a moment. "How many ships?" "Not ships," Morrow said. "Pods." The fabrication order went out through short-range relay, the only communication channel still open within the blockaded system. It was disguised, at Morrow's insistence, as a routine asteroid mining equipment requisition. This was not difficult to disguise because it was technically what it was. The fabrication plants in the belt were already producing extraction pods, small, automated, unpiloted units designed to be fired at asteroid surfaces, latch on, drill, collect, and return. They were manufactured by the thousands. They were boring. They were part of the background noise of a civilization going about its industrial business, which was exactly what the Compact's sensor teams were processing them as. What changed was their interior configuration. In their standard form, extraction pods carried drilling equipment and collection containers. The modified form, specifications transmitted in 3 separate pieces through 3 separate supply logistics channels, assembled by the fabrication AI without any single channel having the complete picture, carried something different. The drilling equipment was replaced with a compressed cargo section, sealed and thermally stabilized. The collection container was replaced with a navigation package, not a full drive, nothing that required an 11-minute charge-up, nothing that registered as a jump signature, a conventional thruster array, very small, very slow, designed to operate at low enough power output that its thermal signature was indistinguishable from background solar radiation at any distance beyond 400 kilometers. Each pod could carry approximately 300 kilograms of sealed cargo. Each pod, once it cleared the inner system under the cover of normal mining operations, would take approximately 11 days to reach the blockade perimeter at minimal signature thrust. 11 days. Moving slowly, quietly as part of a background that 2,000 warships were already in the habit of ignoring. Not jumping, not announcing, just moving. The way that objects in space had always moved before fold drives existed. The way that nobody moved anymore because it was too slow to matter, unless you were planning ahead. Unless you had thought about it quietly in the back of your mind for 30 years. Unless you had built an industrial infrastructure in the asteroid belt that could produce 10,000 small objects per week, and unless those objects were already so ubiquitous in the sensor data of every ship watching you that they registered as noise. The first batch of pods was authorized and began fabrication 6 days into the blockade. By day 10, the first wave of 3,000 was processing through normal mining dispatch channels, logged, cataloged, moving outward through the system on vectors that the Compact's Enforcement Division reviewed and dismissed in automated batch processing. The cargo in those pods: medical supplies, concentrated nutrition packs, atmospheric processor components, seeds, water purification elements. Everything the colonies needed. Nothing that looked like a weapon. Nothing that looked like a breakout attempt. Just supplies, moving very slowly through space in very small containers, below the threshold of what a blockade designed to stop warships was calibrated to consider meaningful. On the compact flagship Unyielding Authority, Admiral Throne Voth received his daily operational briefing at precisely the scheduled hour. Sensor sweeps, nominal. Human military movements, none. Communication traffic within the system, reduced, consistent with a population under communication lockdown. Full drive activation signatures, 0. His intelligence officer mentioned, briefly, an uptick in asteroid belt extraction pod deployment. Standard industrial activity, automated systems, fully consistent with normal human mining operations. It had been reviewed. Nothing of concern. Throne Voth acknowledged the briefing and moved on. In the outer system, 3,000 small objects moved through the dark. Rear Admiral Morrow spent the 11 days doing what she had always done best: logistics. Not the glamorous kind. Not the kind that appeared in military histories. The kind that required sitting in front of a spreadsheet at 0200 hours and working out whether pod batch 17 had the correct nutrient density to cover the caloric shortfall in Proxima Station's rationing protocol, while also accounting for the 3% spoilage rate in the atmospheric processor components if transit temperature dropped below -40. She slept 4 hours a night. Danesh, who had become effectively her chief of staff, slept slightly less. The convoy crews, 14 ships sitting useless in the inner system, their full drives locked, had been repurposed into a logistics coordination cell, each ship's crew assigned to specific colonies, specific supply calculations, specific pod batch manifests. They were very good at it. Freighter crews were always good at logistics. That was the job. On day 4, she received a transmission from her brother on Proxima Station. It was short. He knew she would be busy. He said, "I don't know what's happening out there, but I know you. Whatever you're doing, be careful." She flagged the message. She would answer it later. She went back to the spreadsheet. On day 6, the first signs of stress appeared in the outer colonies. Proxima Station's governor, a woman named Lena Osei, who had been running the station for 12 years and had, in Morrow's assessment, the operational toughness of someone who had spent a decade keeping 4,000 people alive in deep space, transmitted a status report that was factual, calm, and contained exactly one sentence that Morrow read 3 times. "We have begun implementing emergency rationing protocols as of today. Morale is holding. We know someone is working on it." Morrow read that last sentence. She did not let herself feel anything about it until she was alone, and then she allowed herself approximately 90 seconds of a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between the weight of responsibility and the thing that sits underneath it when you know you are carrying it for people who trust you. And then she set it aside and went back to work. On day 8, a problem emerged. One of the compact's outer patrol groups, 12 frigates stationed near the Kuiper Belt perimeter, closer to the exit vectors, had modified their sensor sweep pattern. Not significantly. A 3-degree rotation in their coverage arc, likely a standard procedure adjustment. But the rotation created a narrow overlap zone where the resolution of 2 ships' sensor packages combined in a way that slightly exceeded the background noise threshold that Morrow had calculated. Pod Batch 11, which was already 40% of the way to the perimeter, was transiting through that zone. Danesh flagged it at 0340 hours. Morrow was asleep. Danesh woke her anyway. They had 40 minutes before Batch 11 entered the overlap zone. Morrow looked at the problem for 30 seconds. Reroute the batch, 2-degree yaw adjustment, reduce thrust to 60%. It'll extend their transit time by 19 hours. That pushes Proxima Station's supply arrival past. I know. Recalculate the rationing protocol. We find 19 hours somewhere. She was already pulling up the spreadsheet. What else? Batch 19 is still on schedule. No issues. Batch 19 carries the atmospheric processors. Yes, ma'am. Good. She was quiet for a moment, working through the numbers. Get me the governor of New Perth Colony. I need to know their exact current reserves, not the filed estimate. Exact. Danesh looked at her. It's 400. I know. I'll get her. The problem with Batch 11 was resolved. The 19-hour delay was absorbed through a rationing adjustment that Morrow worked out with Governor Osei's logistics team over the following 2 hours. It was not comfortable math. It required asking people who were already rationing to ration slightly harder. Osei agreed without complaint, and with the particular economy of words that Morrow had come to understand as the signature of someone who had long ago made peace with hard choices. On day 9, Morrow received a transmission from UEDC Command through the encrypted short-range relay network. A message bounced from ship to ship across the inner system in segments, reassembled at the endpoint, time delayed, but intact. It was from Secretary General Diallo. It read, "We are aware of what you're doing. We have not officially sanctioned it. We will not officially deny it. Do what needs doing." A.D. Morrow read it once, nodded, and filed it. On day 10, Pod Batch 1 reached the outer edge of the blockade sphere. This was the part of the plan that had no historical precedent. Not because no one had ever thought of it. Somewhere, at some point, someone had probably run the theoretical math on low-signature transit as a blockade evasion technique. But because it had never been operationally feasible. You needed thousands of small units which required massive fabrication capacity. You needed 11 days of transit time without detection, which required the background noise camouflage of a long-established industrial operation. You needed precise navigation packages in unpiloted pods, which required an automation technology base that had only reached operational reliability in the last decade. You needed, in other words, exactly the combination of industrial, navigational, and logistical development that humanity had quietly assembled over 30 years while the galaxy watched its military capacity and assumed that was all that mattered. The pods didn't stop at the blockade perimeter. They didn't need to. There was no physical barrier, just ships and sensors, and the assumption that anything worth stopping would announce itself. Batch 1 passed through the gaps between compact warships at distances ranging from 900 to 4,000 kilometers, moving slowly, quietly, their thermal signatures folded into the vast background of solar radiation and cosmic noise. Not one of them was detected. At the compact flagship, the automated sensor processing system logged 17,000 discrete objects in the Kuiper Belt transit zone that day. It flagged 0 of them as anomalous. The batch processing algorithm that reviewed objects under 2 meters in diameter, moving below 15 meters per second, with thermal signatures within 2 standard deviations of ambient, which described every single one of Morrow's pods perfectly, dismissed them without human review. 3,000 supplies pods crossed the most powerful blockade in galactic history. They didn't break it. They ignored it. And 2 days later, the first of them arrived at Proxima Station. Governor Osei was in the station's operations center when the proximity alert sounded. Not the emergency klaxon, the soft chime of an inbound object. Non-threatening. Small. Something the automated system had flagged for human review because it was on an approach vector but too small to be a ship. Her operations officer pulled up the sensor data, looked at it again. Governor, it's an asteroid extraction pod. From where? From the inner system. It's been traveling for... He checked the trajectory calculation. 11 days. Osei looked at the screen, at the small, unassuming object approaching her station, at the thermal signature that matched a standard extraction pod perfectly, at the navigation package that had guided it, alone, across 4 billion kilometers of empty space, without a single course correction error. "Open it," she said. The pod's cargo seal released. Inside, medical supplies, concentrated nutrition, atmospheric processor components, wrapped carefully, sealed against temperature variance, enough to cover 2 weeks of the station's current shortfall. 1 pod. There were 3,000 more inbound. Osei stood at the operations window and looked out at the stars for a long moment. Her operations officer was quiet beside her, because he was smart enough to know when someone needed a moment. When she turned back, her eyes were dry. Her expression was entirely composed. Her voice was steady. "Get me a receiving schedule," she said. "I want every pod cataloged and distributed within 6 hours of arrival, and someone get me a line to Rear Admiral Morrow. Communication lockdown. We'll bounce it. Find a way." The way was found. The transmission took 9 hours to reach Morrow through the relay network, arriving in fragments, reassembled by the Arrowhead's communication system at 0200 hours on day 14 of the blockade. It said, "Supplies received, station secure. Whatever you did, it worked. Tell me how." Morrow read it. She was sitting at her desk, the spreadsheet still open, the next 12 batches already in progress. The data in front of her said that at current production rate, she could sustain the supply schedule indefinitely. Not comfortably, not without difficulty, but sustainably. The colonies would not starve. The atmospheric processors would not fail. The people on Proxima Station and New Perth and the 11 other outer settlements would have what they needed. The blockade was still there. 2,000 ships, perfect sphere, 300 million kilometers in every direction. It had not moved. It had not been defeated. No military force had challenged it. It had simply been made irrelevant. It was not Morrow who told the galaxy. It was the Compact. On day 22 of the blockade, a routine intelligence review on the unyielding authority flagged an anomaly. Not in sensor data, the pods were still passing through undetected, but in a commercial shipping manifest from Proxima Station that had been transmitted on a Compact-monitored short-range frequency. The manifest listed incoming cargo received over the previous 8 days. The cargo types were consistent with resupply. The origin code on the manifest referenced inter-system fabrication facilities. The intelligence officer who reviewed it sat with it for an hour before escalating. He was not a slow thinker. He was a thorough one. He wanted to make sure he understood what he was looking at before he told his admiral that the blockade that had never in galactic history been broken might currently be, not broken exactly, circumvented, in the most undramatic possible fashion, by small automated containers that his sensors had been processing as asteroid mining equipment. Admiral Thronevath did not take the news well. He took it quietly. That was in many ways worse, the silence of a very powerful entity re-evaluating a situation it had been completely confident about. He reviewed the data himself. He ordered a full sensor audit going back to the first day of the blockade. What the audit revealed was not comfortable viewing. Thousands of pods crossing the perimeter daily, moving through the most heavily defended cordon in the galaxy, on momentum and patience, and the assumption that his doctrine covered everything worth covering. It hadn't. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "We believe since day 11, sir. The first batches would have begun transit on 11 days. His voice was very controlled. "They began this on day 4. The fabrication orders were placed on day 4. He turned from the display. They read the blockade parameters, identified the sensor threshold, and designed a response within 4 days. His intelligence officer did not respond, because there was nothing to add. Thronevath stood at his window for a long time. Outside it, his fleet hung in its perfect sphere. 2,000 warships, the most powerful blockade ever assembled. And somewhere in the dark between them, hundreds of small containers moved in patient silence, carrying exactly the cargo they needed to carry to the places they needed to carry it, right through the middle of everything he had built. "They're not trying to break the blockade," he said slowly. "They're demonstrating that it doesn't matter." No one replied. "If we increase sensor resolution to cover low-signature objects, it would require retasking 60% of the fleet's processing capacity, sir. And the pods are small enough that at distances below 200 kilometers, we would still face significant false positive." "They designed them that way," Thronevath said. It was not a question. "Almost certainly, yes." He was quiet for a long time. "They want us to know," he said finally. "They want us to find out and understand that we cannot stop it without fundamentally breaking our ability to function as a blockade fleet. This was not just a supply operation. It was a demonstration." He was right. And he knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had just been outthought by a species he had been certain he outclassed, that there was a second problem growing underneath the operational one, because the compact didn't keep secrets well. It was too large, too distributed, too dependent on the cooperative communication networks of 67 member species to maintain tight operational security on something as significant as an ongoing blockade of a major civilization. What Admiral Throne Voth had discovered in his intelligence review would not stay in his intelligence review. It would move through the channels and networks and informal exchanges that connected every species in the galaxy, outward and outward until it reached the places that mattered. It reached them in 11 days, which was, in its own way, fitting. The species that heard it first were the small ones, the Tier 4 and Tier 5 civilizations that the Compact had spent decades blockading, coercing, and economically strangling in ways that were technically legal and practically indistinguishable from slow violence. The species that had always calculated the math and found that resistance was impossible, that the Compact's walls were absolute, that the choices available to them were compliance or irrelevance. They heard about Morrow's pods. They heard about asteroid extraction equipment repurposed into supply containers, about 11-day transits below sensor thresholds, about a rear admiral who had sat in the middle of the most powerful blockade ever assembled and spent 4 days figuring out its noise floor. And what they heard was not just a logistics story. What they heard was, the walls are not absolute. The diplomatic consequences arrived before the military ones. 3 Compact member species, not the powerful core members but the middle-tier civilizations that had long held quiet resentments about the Compact's enforcement practices, filed formal procedural objections to the continued blockade within 48 hours of the story becoming widely known. The objections were legal in nature, citing Compact charter provisions on proportional response. By themselves, they would have been manageable. But they came with something attached, the detailed technical specifications of Morrow's pod system, filed as a legal exhibit, illustrating that the blockade's humanitarian impact had been overstated because a workaround existed. The specifications were now in the public Compact legal record, available to anyone. Secretary General Diallo watched this unfold from Earth with the focused attention of someone who had spent 11 years learning how the Compact's internal politics actually worked, rather than how they were supposed to work. She had 3 senior legal counselors working around the clock. She had 4 diplomatic communications running simultaneously with Compact member species whose support she had been quietly building for years. She had, it turned out, been building the long game at the same time that Morrow had been running the short one. When the Compact's internal council convened an emergency review of the blockade on day 26, she was ready. She didn't go in asking for the blockade to be lifted. She went in presenting evidence. Evidence that the blockade had failed its stated humanitarian threshold, because the colonies it had been designed to pressure had not been deprived of supplies. Evidence that the blockade had failed its legal proportionality test, because 3 independent legal filings by member species had raised the question formally, and the Council was required to address it. Evidence, most devastatingly, that the intelligence failure involved in not detecting the pod operation for 11 days raised serious questions about whether the Enforcement Division was fit to be running a containment measure of this scale. She did not say you failed. She said the mechanism failed. She did not attack the Compact. She attacked the specific operation. The distinction was careful and precise and legally significant, and it drove a wedge exactly where she had measured the gap. 3 hours into the Council session, the Velthari bloc, already weakened by the fallout from Kepler, declined to vote in favor of continued blockade. 2 swing vote species abstained, which under Compact voting rules had the same effect as a no. The resolution to continue the blockade failed by 2 votes. On the unyielding authority, Admiral Throne Voth received the Council's decision at 1600 hours. He spent 4 minutes reviewing it. Then, he issued the stand-down order to his fleet, 2,000 warships, slowly changing their perfect geometry, beginning the long process of dispersal back to their home bases. The ring around the solar system dissolved. It did not dissolve because it was defeated in battle. It dissolved because a woman sitting in a stationary convoy escort ship had spent 4 days doing math. Morrow heard about the blockade's dissolution through the relay network, the same way she had been receiving all news for 26 days. Fragmented, time-delayed, reassembled. The message was from Dinesh, who had excellent situational awareness and a gift for brevity. It said, "It's down. You did it." Morrow read it. She was at her desk. She had been at her desk for most of the last 26 days. The spreadsheet was still open. She saved it, closed it, and sat for a moment in the quiet of her cabin. Outside the Arrowhead's hull, the solar system, unblockaded, the familiar stars in their familiar positions, the outer planets going about their ancient business as if 2,000 warships had never surrounded them. She thought about the 11 days, the sensor noise floor calculations, the modified pods moving through 4 billion kilometers of dark space, the governor of Proxima Station at her operations window, looking at a small container that had crossed a galactic blockade on conventional thrusters and patience. She thought about her brother. She had never answered his message. She opened the comm system and started typing. It was short. She was tired, and she had a lot of work still to do. The supply schedule needed to be transitioned back to normal convoy operations. The fabrication orders wound down. The convoy fold drive lockouts formally cleared through UEDC logistics. Her message said, "Sorry I didn't write back. I was busy. Everything's fine. Tell me when you're free for dinner." She sent it. She pulled up the next task file. She started working. In the days after the blockade dissolved, the galaxy processed what had happened in the particular way that major paradigm shifts were always processed. Slowly at first, then all at once, with a great deal of argument about what it actually meant. Military analysts focused on the operational aspects, the sensor threshold calculation, the use of industrial infrastructure as a strategic asset, the use of transit time as a feature rather than a limitation. 3 separate compact member species filed classified requests for the full technical specifications within a week of the pod system's details becoming public record, which was either concerning or, depending on your perspective, encouraging. It meant that other civilizations were thinking about what they could do with the same approach. Diplomatic analysts focused on Diallo's council strategy, the surgical use of legal mechanism and coalition building that had turned an intelligence failure into a political defeat for the enforcement bloc. Seminars on it were being proposed at 3 compact member academies within a month. But what spread furthest, across news relays, through informal communication networks, in the conversations of species who had spent decades telling themselves that the compact's walls were absolute, was simpler than the operational analysis or the legal strategy. It was the image of 3,000 extraction pods. Ordinary, industrial, boring, moving slowly through space. Too small to matter, too common to notice, too patient to stop. Getting through anyway. Not by being stronger than the wall, not by being faster than the wall, by being something the wall hadn't been built to see. On Proxima Station, Governor Osei posted an official account of the supply operation to the station's public record. It was factual and detailed and deliberately unsexy. It described pod dimensions and transit times and cargo manifests and rationing protocols. It read in large stretches like exactly what it was, a logistics report. At the bottom, she had added one line that was not part of the operational record. This station was never in danger of being forgotten. Someone was always working on it, that's worth knowing. On the Arrowhead, Lieutenant Dinesh watched the outer solar system through the observation port as the convoy fold drives received their clearance codes and came back online, one by one, filling the bridge with the familiar hum of drives warming up and a journey resuming. Morrow came onto the bridge as the last clearance came through. She looked at the drive's display, all green, all charged, ready. "Course for the outer colonies," she said. "Standard convoy formation. Full manifest." "Aye, ma'am." Dinesh looked at her. "You know they're going to want to debrief you for weeks." "I know, and there will probably be hearings and reports, and someone will want to name something after you." "Nobody is naming anything after me," Morrow said firmly. "A pod, maybe." "Absolutely not. The Morrow pod, Has a nice... Plot the course, Dinesh. Dinesh plotted the course, smiling at her station. The arrowhead began to move, the convoy falling into formation behind it. 14 freighters carrying medical equipment and seed stock and construction materials, and everything else that a civilization moving outward into the dark needed to keep moving. The fold drives built toward jump. The solar system fell behind. Ahead, the outer colonies and the people in them and the work of keeping them alive and connected and part of something larger than themselves. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work that no military history would ever fully describe because it didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in spreadsheets at Oro 200 hours. In conversations with governors about rationing adjustments. In navigation code compiled for a small automated pod that needed to travel 4 billion kilometers alone and arrive at exactly the right place. The arrowhead folded into jump. Around it, the convoy followed. And out there, somewhere in the vast dark between stars, the last of the extraction pods, the ones from the final batches, still in transit when the blockade lifted, continued on their patient trajectories. They didn't know the blockade was gone. They had no sensors, no receivers, no awareness of what had changed. They simply moved, as they had been programmed to move, toward the places they had been sent. They would arrive in 11 days. They would be received, and the people who received them would know, not from a military victory, not from a diplomatic announcement, but from the simple fact of a package arriving, that someone, somewhere, had thought about them carefully enough to make sure they wouldn't be left behind. That was the thing no blockade had ever been built to stop. And no blockade ever would be. The colony ship Ardent Hope drifted through the Kepler expanse like a sleeping heartbeat. Slow, warm, full of life. It was not a military vessel. It carried no cannons, no rail drivers, no shielded battle plating along its hull. What it carried was far more precious, far more fragile. 431 children, ages 3 to 16, the sons and daughters of the Meridian Colony Project. Children who had never seen Earth, who had grown up between the stars, who knew the smell of recycled air as intimately as any prairie wind. They were being transferred to Helix Station, a grand academic hub at the edge of Dominion space, where they would receive the finest education in 7-star systems. Their parents had wept at the departure dock. Proud weeping, hopeful weeping, that was 6 days ago. On the bridge of the Ardent Hope, Captain Mara Solis reviewed the navigation logs for the 14th time that morning. Something had been bothering her since they crossed into the Velkathari corridor, a stretch of space technically classified as neutral territory, though everyone in the shipping lanes knew the Velkath considered it theirs by birthright. She'd filed the appropriate transit permits. She'd paid the corridor tax, 3 times the standard rate, as required for human vessels. She'd even transmitted the ceremonial greeting sequence that Velkath diplomacy demanded. 7 pulses of amber light, followed by complete radio silence for 60 seconds. She had done everything right, which was why the 3 Velkath warships appearing on her radar at 0413 hours felt like a thunderclap on a clear day. They're not responding to hails, her comms officer, Lieutenant Davin Marsh, said. His voice was careful, controlled. I've tried all 7 registered Velkath diplomatic frequencies. Try the emergency band. Tried it, Captain. Nothing. Mara stared at the tactical display. 3 Velkath Spineclaw-class destroyers, each one 3 times the mass of the Ardent Hope, had arranged themselves in a triangular formation directly across their flight path. It was a blockade posture. It was also, she knew from her years in deep space transit, a hunting posture. Wake the children's supervisors, she said quietly. Tell them to keep everyone calm and in their quarters. Do not... She paused, steadying her voice. Do not tell the children anything yet. The next 40 minutes unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The Velkath ship sent no warning, no ultimatum, no demand. They simply opened fire. Not at the hull, not at the engines. They fired with surgical, deliberate precision at the Ardent Hope's communications array first, shearing it clean off in a single blast that rocked the ship like a toy in a tide. Then the port thrusters, then the emergency beacon housing. One by one, Every system that could call for help was targeted and destroyed with the kind of methodical patience that spoke not of battle rage, but of a plan long rehearsed. Mara had time to send one message. She screamed it into the emergency subspace burst, an old low-tech channel that didn't route through the primary array. It was slow, it was ugly, it would take hours to reach anyone, but it was all she had. Ardent hope to any vessel. We are under attack in the Velkathari corridor. Civilian ship, 431 children aboard. We are. The subspace transmitter went dark. What happened next aboard the Ardent Hope was recorded only by the ship's internal black box logs. Logs that would later be retrieved, reviewed, and entered into the permanent record of the Galactic Tribunal. Every sound, every scream, every desperate attempt by the crew to shield the children in the deepest compartments of the ship. It took the Velkath 47 minutes to finish. When their warships finally peeled away from the wreckage and vanished back into the dark, the Ardent Hope was no longer a ship. It was a cooling graveyard of bent metal and silence, tumbling slowly through the corridor like a broken toy discarded by a child too large for this galaxy. 431 children. None survived. Back on Helix Station, a supervisor named Councilwoman Preth Veldara of the Velkath delegation was drinking her morning tea when the news arrived. She read the preliminary report twice. Then she set down her cup very carefully, smoothed her robes, and sent a single-line encrypted message to the Velkath High Command. Confirmed. The package has been delivered. She did not know, none of them knew, what had just been awakened. Because the subspace burst, moving at its slow, grinding speed through the dark, had already reached its first receiver. It had reached Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, and Jonas Kale had children of his own. Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale received the subspace burst at 0611 hours aboard the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, the flagship of humanity's 7th Deep Space Fleet, currently on routine patrol near the Belthian Reach. He read it standing up. His communications officer, a young ensign named Reyes, had printed it on a physical slip of paper, old protocol for emergency subspace bursts, and handed it to the Admiral without a word. Reyes had read it first. He'd had to. Standard security procedure. And his hands, the Admiral noticed, were shaking. Kale read it. He read it again. He set it face down on the console. For exactly 12 seconds, Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, 32-year veteran of the United Human Navy, survivor of the Battle of Drengar's Mouth, man who had once held a collapsing bulkhead shut with his bare hands for 4 minutes while his crew evacuated, said absolutely nothing. Then he picked up the fleet-wide command channel. This is Admiral Kale. Full battle readiness. All ships. Right now. His second-in-command, Rear Admiral Una Park, was on the bridge in 90 seconds. She took one look at his face and didn't ask questions. She simply moved to her station and began issuing the orders that turned a fleet at rest into a fleet with a purpose. Kyle sent 3 messages before his ships even finished their readiness checks. The first went to Helix Station. Confirm status of Ardent Hope. All available data. Immediate priority. The second went to the United Human Embassy in Velkath Space. Do not issue any statements. Do not take any meetings. Stand by. The third went to Earth, to the Secretary General of the Human Collective, to the Joint Chiefs, to the full Security Council. It was 4 sentences long. The Velkath Dominion has attacked and destroyed the civilian colony vessel Ardent Hope in the Velkathari corridor. 431 human children are confirmed dead. No survivors. Awaiting your orders, but advise you give them quickly. The response from Earth took 11 minutes. When it came, it was not from the Secretary General. It was from President Alara Voss herself, the first human head of state to contact a field admiral directly since the Callisto crisis 30 years ago. Her message was 6 words. You have everything you need. Go. What followed in the next 18 hours was something that military historians would later describe with a single, haunting phrase. The quiet mobilization. There were no speeches on the news feeds, no dramatic press conferences, no grandstanding politicians standing before cameras with fire in their eyes. The human collective government went silent, deliberately, completely silent. and that silence was louder than any declaration of war. But the galaxy watched, and the galaxy saw what was moving. Every Velkath monitoring station in a 12-system radius began logging anomalies within the first 6 hours. Ship signatures, lots of them. Not the usual trickle of freighters and patrol vessels. These were warship signatures, the distinctive quantum fold distortion patterns of human military vessels jumping from their home systems in coordinated waves. The Velkath High Command received their first intelligence report at hour 7. Their chief military analyst, a 4-limbed strategist named Keth Voran, stared at the numbers for a long time before he spoke. "That cannot be correct," he said. "It is correct, High Commander," his aide replied. "We have confirmed 67 human warships in transit toward our border. The count is still climbing." Keth Voran turned to the wall-sized star map behind him, where small red indicators were blinking into existence across the sector like stars being born. "How many fleets does this represent?" 3 confirmed fleets, High Commander, possibly 4. A pause. "There are also reports of human vessels being recalled from the outer reaches in the Cygnus patrol line. They appear to be consolidating." For what purpose? Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. On the wreckage recovery vessel, Tenacious, Lieutenant Commander Faye Oduya led the team that reached the Ardent Hope at hour 14. She had volunteered for the assignment. She had not told anyone that she had a niece who had been aboard. Her team worked in silence. Recovery operations always had a kind of grim professionalism to them. The work of finding the dead was not performed with grief, because grief would make your hands shake and your vision blur, and you could not afford either when you were working in the debris field of a shattered ship. Grief came later in the dark, alone. But when Lieutenant Commander Oduya entered what remained of the Ardent Hope's primary shelter compartment, the deepest, most protected section of the ship, the one the crew had clearly tried to use as a final refuge, she stopped. The walls were covered in drawings, children's drawings, crayon and marker on the bare metal panels clearly made in those final terrible minutes when the crew had been trying to keep the children calm, when the adults had been running out of words and had handed the children drawing tools instead. Sons with faces, stick figure families, rockets, stars. A repeated motif that appeared in at least a dozen drawings. A blue-green planet with a ring of light around it. Earth, drawn by children who had never seen it, who only knew it from pictures and stories, who had drawn it in their last minutes alive because it was the most beautiful thing they could imagine. Faye Oduya stood there for a full minute. Then she took out her personal recorder and documented every single drawing, meticulously, one by one. Those images were transmitted to Fleet Admiral Kale with a single attached note. "So you don't forget what you're doing this for." Kyle had them printed and pinned to the wall of his command center. He did not take them down. At hour 18, the Velkath Dominion's ambassador to the Galactic Accord, a senior diplomat named Velsor Kwan, formally requested an emergency closed session with the Accord's Peacekeeping Council. He was told the session had already been scheduled, by the humans. He was also told, politely but with no room for ambiguity, that the human delegation would not be presenting grievances. They would be presenting evidence. The Galactic Accord's Grand Chamber had hosted 47 emergency sessions in its 200-year history. Wars, plagues, the extinction event at Morvel 4, the Syndicate collapse. Its curved walls of pale stone had absorbed every kind of catastrophe the galaxy could produce. It had never seen anything quite like this. Every seat was filled. Species that hadn't sent delegations to the Accord in decades had dispatched representatives overnight. The Velkath delegation sat in their designated arc of seats, all 11 of them, and if they had been capable of sweating, they would have been. Ambassador Velsor Kwan had prepared a defense. A careful, layered, legally intricate defense built on 3 pillars: the Ardent Hope's alleged failure to properly file corridor transit papers, a disputed interpretation of the Velkathari Sovereignty Agreement, and a suggestion, carefully worded, never quite stated outright, that the humans had been running some kind of intelligence operation using the children's vessel as cover. He never got to deliver it, because when the human delegation entered the chamber, they were led not by a diplomat. They were led by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kyle. He wore his dress uniform, every medal, every decoration. 32 years of service arranged across his chest in neat rows. He walked to the human delegation's podium and placed his hands on it and looked out at the chamber. And the chamber went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something large and patient has entered them. He did not begin with legal arguments. He pressed a button. The chamber's central holographic display, a massive sphere of light designed to show star maps and tactical displays, filled instead with a single image, the crayon drawings from the shelter compartment of the Ardent Hope. He had arranged them in a grid, all of them. Every Earth with its ring of light, every smiling sun, every stick figure family, every rocket ship with a child's name written on the side in a child's careful, imperfect handwriting. He let the chamber look at them for 60 seconds. Then he spoke. Their names, he said, were on the manifest. He touched the podium again and the drawings were replaced by a list, a long scrolling list of names, ages, and home colonies. I'm going to read them. The Velkath ambassador began to rise. Admiral, this is highly irregular. The Accord's proceedings require— Sit down, said 12 different species representatives, simultaneously. Velsor Kwan sat down. Jonas Kale began to read. It took 19 minutes. 431 names, ages, where they were born, what they liked, because Kale's team had contacted every family, and the families had sent him things. A note that said Liam loved drawing starships and wanted to be an engineer. A note that said Priya was afraid of the dark and always slept with her light on. A note that said Tomas was 6 years old, and his favorite word was why, and he asked it about everything, all the time, every single day. By the time Admiral Kale reached the 215th name, 3 non-human delegates were visibly distressed. By the 350th, the chamber was the quietest it had ever been in 200 years. At 431 he stopped. He looked up from the list. I have documentation, he said in the same quiet, steady voice, that proves the Velkath High Command ordered this attack. I have the encrypted message sent by Councilwoman Preth Veldara confirming the attack was deliberate, planned, and sanctioned at the highest levels of the Velkath government. He paused. I also have 73 warships positioned at the boundary of Velkath space. The chamber erupted. Multiple delegations speaking at once. The Accord's chief arbiter hammering for order. The Velkath ambassador on his feet, shouting denials. But they were the wrong kind of denials. Too fast and too loud. The denials of a man who already knows the evidence exists and is hoping volume will serve where logic cannot. It took 4 minutes for the chamber to settle. When it did, it was because a delegation that almost never spoke had asked for the floor. The Mirathi Collective, the oldest spacefaring civilization in the Accord, a species so ancient that 3 of the galaxy's current starfaring cultures were descended from their early colonies, had not issued a formal statement in 60 years. Their representative, an elder called Sev Amarant, moved to the central speaking position with the slow, deliberate care of extreme age. When Sev Amarant spoke, every other voice in the galaxy, it sometimes seemed, stopped to listen. We have reviewed the Admiral's evidence, the elder said. The Mirathi's translator rendered their voice as something low and resonant, like sound traveling through deep water. It is complete. It is unambiguous. The Velkath Dominion ordered the deliberate murder of 431 non-combatant human children in neutral space. A pause of exactly 3 seconds. The Mirathi Collective formally recognizes humanity's right of full military response. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. It was the silence of a door closing that will not open again. In the Velkath Dominion's capital, the High Command had been watching the Accord session on secure feed. When Sev Amarant finished speaking, High Commander Keth Varan turned away from the display and looked at his senior staff. How many human ships are now confirmed at our border? He asked. His intelligence chief answered without looking up from his console. The answer was the same as the last answer, but larger now. Much larger. 91 warships, High Commander. 3 full carrier groups. Admiral Kale has also been joined by vessels from 6 allied human colony systems. A pause. and the Brithani Trade Federation has recalled its own ships from Velkath space. The Brithani? Keth Varan's voice was very quiet. Yes, sir. They cited moral objection to continued presence in Velkath territory. Similar notices have been filed by the Tesseri Cooperative and the Lundara Compact. Keth Varan understood what that meant. It wasn't just warships gathering at his border. It was the galaxy turning its back. One by one, the trade routes closing, the diplomatic channels going cold, the slowly, methodically, inexorably tightening isolation of a civilization that had made a catastrophic mistake and was only now beginning to understand the true dimensions of what it had done. He had thought humans were like every other species, capable of being pushed, of being provoked, of having lines crossed, and then, eventually, of being managed back down. Every species could be negotiated with, delayed, redirected. Patience and politics, in Keth Varan's long experience, could outlast almost any anger. He was learning something now that he should have known before he ordered those warships into the corridor. Human grief was not a fire that burned and faded. It was a forge. The formal ultimatum was delivered at hour 71. Not by a diplomat, not through the Accord's channels. It was transmitted directly to the Velkath High Command, on a military frequency by Fleet Admiral Jonas Kale, from the bridge of the UHNS Sovereign Wrath, which was now positioned 14,000 kilometers from the Velkath Dominion's primary border station. It was 11 sentences long. It demanded the immediate surrender of every individual in the chain of command that had ordered and executed the attack on the Ardent Hope. It demanded full reparations to the families of every child killed. It demanded the permanent dissolution of the Velkathari Corridor sovereignty claim, and its cession to the Galactic Accord as neutral administered territory. It demanded a formal public apology broadcast on every Velkath communications channel for no fewer than 30 consecutive days, and it gave the Velkath High Command 1 hour to comply. Or what? High Commander Keth Varan had reportedly asked when the message finished playing. His intelligence chief had pulled up the latest sensor data and put it on screen without a word. 91 warships, 3 carrier groups, alongside them now, and this was the part that had begun keeping the entire High Command awake at night, a growing convoy of civilian vessels, not military, not combat ships, transports, habitat modules, construction barges. The kind of fleet you built not to fight over a territory but to move into it. The humans weren't just coming to destroy. They were coming to stay. And that, somehow in a way that military might alone could never have communicated, was the thing that finally broke the High Command's certainty. You could rebuild from a defeat. You could regroup, rearm, reclaim. History was full of defeated empires that had risen again, but you could not reclaim land that was already occupied, already settled, already lived in by a species that had 431 reasons to make absolutely certain it would never, ever be moved. The emergency session of the Velkath High Command lasted 6 minutes. The formal request for negotiated surrender was transmitted at hour 71 minutes and 58 seconds. It arrived with 2 seconds to spare. Councilwoman Preth Veldara was arrested by Accord peacekeeping officers 4 hours later, along with 14 members of the Velkath military command structure. The evidence Admiral Kale had presented left no room for interpretation, and the Accord, for the first time in its history, voted unanimously to authorize extradition. The vote was 219-0. The Velkath delegation abstained. It was the closest thing to a confession the chamber had ever seen. Feoduya was not on the Sovereign Wrath when the surrender came through. She was still on the Tenacious, finishing the recovery operation on the Ardent Hope. There was still work to do, careful, quiet, necessary work. She was still in the shelter compartment when her comms unit buzzed with the news. She read it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she looked up at the wall of drawings around her, the blue-green earth with its rings of light drawn over and over again by 431 children, who had never seen it, who had only ever known the space between stars. She thought about what it meant that those drawings existed, that in the last minutes, surrounded by darkness and fear, and the sounds of their world ending, children had reached for crayons and drawn the most beautiful thing they knew. She thought that maybe that was the most human thing of all. Not the warships, not the ultimatum, not the 91-ship fleet that had made an empire flinch. The drawing. The refusal to stop imagining something beautiful. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the wall, not touching the drawings, just near them, the way you stand near something precious without presuming to hold it. "We came back for you," she said quietly. "All of you. We came back." The Ardent Hope's black box recorder was recovered, and its contents entered into the permanent historical record of the Galactic Accord. The children's drawings were digitally preserved and transmitted to every species in the Accord, a gesture that Kale had authorized personally, over the objections of several of his own staff who felt it was manipulative. "Good," he'd said. "Let them be moved." The Vel-Cathari corridor was ceded to Accord administration within 90 days. A permanent memorial beacon was placed at the coordinates where the Ardent Hope had been destroyed, a simple light, white and steady, visible on long-range sensors for 11 light-years in every direction. Its official designation in the Accord's navigation registry was clinical, bureaucratic, and easy to miss if you weren't looking. But every human pilot in the deep lanes knew what it meant. They had a different name for it. They called it the Children's Lamp. And for a generation of Velcath navigators, it became the single most carefully avoided set of coordinates in their star charts, not because of any law or treaty, but because of something simpler and older and far more durable than either. Because when you pass a light that marks the place where 431 children drew pictures of Earth in their final minutes, you feel it. Whatever you are, whatever you have done, however many light years of cold space separate you from the concept of conscience, you feel it, and you go around,